So here is the introduction. The first is the background. Affected by COVID-19, Australia's economic development slowed down. In order to promote the economic growth of Australia, the Australian government has adopted a loose monetary policy to stimulate economic growth. Our approach is studying Australia's monetary policy and inflation, and the purpose is to understand the current development of Australia. There are three key points. The first is find out which kind of money supply is most affected by monetary policy, and the second one is collected Australia's monetary policy in response to the epidemic and analyze its impact on inflation, and the last is evaluate the effectiveness of Australia's money policy during COVID-19.
About the COVID-19 to economics. COVID-19 has disrupted the historical growth model of the Australian economy. With the relief of most COVID-19 restrictions and the health measures, economic growth has returned to long-term growth mode. The biggest impact from COVID-19 has been on household consumption, with nationwide lockdown resulting in lower spending on services, dining and entertainment. Economic consumption gradually recovers as consumers stay at home longer and international borders gradually reopen. Secondly, taxes on production fares early in the pandemic, reflected in GST, wages and gambling taxes. Due to business restrictions and lost employment and working hours during the lockdown, taxes have recovered as the economic reopens, supported by strong domestic demand in the labor market.
It is clear from the line and bar chart of the data that both GDP and CPI shows relatively large downward trend in the COVID phase, especially around February 2020. At that time, the Australian government began to face up to COVID and began to control it, resulting in Australia GDP falling by nearly 7% in the following months and the CPI falling to the same state in 2019. However, after subsequent gradual levelization, both data had a bottom-out trend, and both growth rates have the substantial increase. In general, the external shocks is a phase, and after the economic return, all value will return to the normal or even be improved. And the rest of the data is very resistant to shocks, so the chart does not look very affected.
With more money supply, it can be assumed that the curve of money supply moves to the right and the curve of money demand does not move. Since the curve of the money demand is down to the right, the curve of the money supply will intersect with the curve of money demand at the right side of the original interest rate, which means the new equivalent interest rate is smaller than the original interest rate. When the aggregate demand curve moves to the right when the increasing demand, while the aggregate supply, which is defined by the productive and technology, may be not changed, since the curve of the short-term aggregate supply is up to the right and the curve of the long-term aggregate supply is vertical. The price, which can be defined by the intersection of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply increase.
I as a model to analyze the impact of monetary policy adopted by Australia in response to COVID-19. This expansionary monetary policy helped greatly increase the money supply. The reaction in ISM is the redshift of the LM curve. We can use figure 1 to show that new EKM goes from 0.1 to the 0.2, all the conditions remain unchanged, with a high output but low interest rates. Is that the case? We can look at the actual data of the Australia in COVID-19. Figure 2 shows the trend of the money supply and the interest rate from the fourth quarter of 2018 to the second quarter of 2022. Here we use the value of borrowed money in ABS as money supply, and we can find the trend of the money supply is in the opposite direction to the interest rate. When monetary policy is implemented, the money supply will increase and the interest rate will decline.
I know that the Australian government also adopts other fiscal policies to deal with COVID-19, but the primary goal of monetary policy is to maintain the inflation rate at 2% to 3%. Therefore, we can look at Australia's inflation rate here. The inflation rate adopted is calculated based on the monthly CPI data published by ABS. The dark brown line is the change of CPI, that is, the inflation rate. We can find that Australia's inflation rate has always remained below 2%, which is sufficient to prove the effectiveness of monetary policy. In February this year, Australia's expansionary monetary policy ended, and the second quarter showed a decline in inflation, which is consistent with our research conclusions. Finally, thanks to the Australian government, we don't have to face such serious inflation.